The desert don't forgive, and neither did the settlers who left her there. Abigail Reed lay half buried in the sand, lips cracked, skin blistered, the wagon tracks fading in the distance. Her husband had died days ago, fevered and weak, and the others decided she'd only slow them down. They took the horses and left her to die. When the sun dipped low, she saw a shadow move against the rocks, tall, silent, watching. A Navajo warrior stepped from the red dust, his eyes sharp as flint. He didn't speak English, but he saw her pain. Without a word, he lifted her into his arms. She thought it was the end. She didn't know it was the beginning of a life she'd never imagined. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a ride into the Old West. The world came back to Abigail in fragments, the taste of cool water on a split tongue, the rough scrape of sandstone beneath her palms, the ache of life forcing itself into a body that had already given up. For a long while, she didn't know if she was alive or dreaming, the wind whispering through the canyon walls like voices from the next world. When her eyes opened fully, she found herself beneath the shadow of a great red cliff, the sun cut off by its jagged edge, and beside her lay a small pool fed by a trickle of water from the rocks above. Her lips trembled as she reached for it, but before she could move, a hand appeared, dark, calloused, steady, holding a gourd to her mouth. The water touched her lips, cool and clean, and she drank greedily until the hand pulled back. That was when she saw him, the warrior who had carried her from the desert. He stood a few paces away, tall and silent, his face unreadable beneath streaks of dust and the faint marks of paint faded by sun and wind. His name, she would learn much later, was Tarak. For now, he was only a shadow with eyes that saw everything. He didn't speak, only crouched by the fire he'd built, stirring the embers until they glowed. Her mind swam with fear stories she'd heard in town of raids and savages, of women taken and never seen again, and though she wanted to flee, her body betrayed her, weak as water. She tried to sit, but pain flared sharp in her ribs, forcing her back down. Tarak noticed but made no move to stop her, only tore a strip of cloth from his own tunic and dipped it in the spring, pressing it to her blistered forehead. The gesture was careful, almost reverent. When he spoke, his words were low, foreign, rhythmic, a language she didn't know but somehow understood through tone alone. Comfort, assurance, patience. He left food beside her: roasted rabbit, berries, a handful of roots she didn't recognize, and when she didn't touch it, he simply nodded, once and turned away, walking toward the canyon's edge where the moon was beginning to rise. She watched him from the shadows, torn between gratitude and terror, her mind warring with everything she'd been taught. He had saved her life, that much was certain, but why? In the desert, nothing was given freely. As the night deepened, the canyon filled with the hum of crickets and the distant cry of coyotes. Tarak returned once, checked the bandage he'd tied around her arm, and set a new log on the fire. He sat near it, cross-legged, his face catching the firelight, features carved in stillness. Abigail drifted in and out of sleep, waking once to see him gazing up at the stars, his lips moving silently, a prayer, perhaps, or something older. When dawn came, the desert turned gold, and she woke to the smell of smoke and the sound of a riverbird calling in the distance. Her strength had begun to return, though her fear hadn't left. She pushed herself up slowly, testing her limbs, and found a small bowl of water waiting by her side. Tarak was gone. For a moment, panic flared the emptiness around her, vast and humming, until she saw him at the edge of the pool, gathering reeds, his movements precise, unhurried. He turned when she stirred, his gaze meeting hers. No threat, no command, just a nod, as if to say, "You're safe." Then he went back to his work, leaving her alone with the rising sun and the dawning realization that whatever fate had brought him to her in that endless sea of sand, it had not been cruelty nor chance. It had been mercy, the rarest thing the desert ever gave. The days blurred into one another, the endless rhythm of sun and shadow marking time in the canyon. And with each dawn that broke over the red stone, Abigail Reed felt herself stitched a little more firmly back into the world of the living. Her strength returned slowly, like water filling a cracked vessel, and so did her awareness of the man who had pulled her back from death. Tarak moved through the canyon like part of it, quiet, deliberate, never wasting motion or word. He rose with the sun and vanished into the desert with a bough slung over his shoulder, leaving her small tasks gathering water, tending the fire as though he knew that doing them kept her from falling into fear again. At first, she hated the silence between them. It was too big, too full of everything unsaid. She tried speaking small, uncertain words like thank you or please, but they only echoed back against the canyon walls, swallowed by wind and distance. Tarak never seemed offended by what she didn't understand. Instead, he began to teach without speaking at all. He pointed at the sky. Ta-ah, he said softly, the word round in his mouth. Sky. He touched the ground. Kea. Earth. When she repeated them, he nodded once, a faint smile breaking through the solemn mask of his face. They learned each other that way, word by word, gesture by gesture, until the space between them no longer felt like a wall but a bridge built from patience. She began to watch him differently. Then the way he knelt at the spring each morning to murmur something to the water before drinking. How he treated every living thing, from the smallest lizard to the old, gnarled juniper tree, with a quiet respect that made her ache. When he returned from his hunts, he always left part of his catch near the canyon edge, whispering a word she didn't know an offering, she realized, to whatever spirits ruled this land. In town, she'd been taught the desert was cruel, empty, godless. But here, in the hush of the canyon, she began to see it differently, not dead, but sacred. At night, when the fire burned low and the sky turned to a sea of stars, she sometimes caught him watching her with a look she couldn't name, not possession, not pity, but something steady and searching, as if trying to understand her as deeply as she tried to understand him. One night, unable to bear the silence any longer, she whispered into the glow, "Why did you save me?" Her voice sounded small, fragile against the vastness of the canyon. For a long while, he didn't move. She thought he hadn't understood, or perhaps chosen not to answer. But then, slowly, he turned toward her. The firelight caught his face, softening the lines carved by sun and wind. He placed his hand on his chest, where his heartbeat thudded beneath skin and bone, and said a single word, "Heart." Then he gestured toward her, repeating it softly, almost like a vow. Heart. The word hung between them, carrying more meaning than any language she'd ever known. Abigail felt her throat tighten, not with fear this time, but with something unfamiliar, gratitude, confusion, maybe even hope. Tarak gave a small nod, as if to say that was enough, and looked back toward the stars. The silence that followed wasn't empty anymore. It was full of understanding, a quiet that spoke louder than words ever could. The morning was still and golden, the kind of desert dawn that felt like the world itself was holding its breath before the heat came to claim it. Abigail knelt by the spring, dipping her hands into the cold water and watching it ripple outward across the stones, her reflection breaking into pieces beneath her trembling fingers. She had grown used to the rhythm of the canyon, the rustle of wind through mesquite, the distant cry of hawks, the quiet scrape of Tarek's footsteps as he moved through the narrow pass, and for the first time in weeks, she felt something close to peace. But as she filled the small clay jug Tarak had made for her, a glint of movement caught her eye far beyond the red ridge. Dust faint at first, then thicker, rising in columns that moved like ghosts across the horizon. Her breath caught. Wagons, horses. She blinked against the sun, her heart lurching with wild, impossible hope. It was them, the settlers, who had left her behind. Maybe they had come back. Maybe they'd realized what they'd done. She scrambled to her feet, water spilling down her dress, and climbed the rocky slope, her lungs burning as she reached the top. "Hey!" she shouted, her voice cracking against the empty air. The figures turned small at first, then larger as they drew closer. She could see their faces now, men she once knew, dust-covered and wary, their rifles glinting in the morning light. "It's me," she cried, waving her arms. "It's Abigail, I'm alive!" For a heartbeat they froze. Then the sound of rifles cocking filled the air like thunder. "Get back!" one of them shouted, his voice sharp with fear. "Step away from that savage!" She spun, confused, just as Tarak appeared behind her, silent as ever, bow in hand but lowered, his eyes scanning the ridge. He didn't understand the words, but he didn't need to. Their posture said enough. "No!" Abigail cried, turning back to the men. "He saved me, he—" But her words were drowned by the crack of gunfire. A bullet struck the stone near her feet, spraying shards of rock. Tarek moved instantly, stepping in front of her, his body a shield between her and the guns. His bow came up, an arrow knocked but never loosed. "Stop!" she screamed again, her voice raw. "He's not the enemy." The men hesitated, their faces hard and twisted with a fear that looked too much like hatred. "We thought you were dead," one shouted. "Then we saw you with him, and what else were we supposed to think? You been livin' with them? You've gone native, girl." Another voice joined in, uglier, louder. "She's tainted. Leave her to him," she made her choice. Abigail's stomach turned. "You left me," she screamed, tears stinging her eyes. "You left me to die." But they were already turning, muttering among themselves as they spurred their horses. One of them spat into the dust. "Ain't no place for you with us no more." The wagons creaked back into motion, their silhouettes fading into the bright, merciless light of the desert. Tarek lowered his bow slowly, his gaze still fixed on the horizon long after the sound of wheels had vanished. Abigail stood trembling behind him, every ounce of hope draining out of her like blood from an open wound. She sank to her knees, the sand hot beneath her palms, sobbing silently. Tarek turned, crouched beside her, and for a long time said nothing. He didn't have to. His hand brushed her shoulder lightly, grounding her, steadying her. When she finally looked up, his eyes met hers calm, deep, certain, and she understood that whatever life she'd had before, whatever world had cast her out, it was gone. The settlers had taken her name, her people, her place. But Tarek, the man the desert had sent instead, had given her something she never thought she'd find again: belonging. Night came soft and slow, spreading shadows over the canyon until the red walls turned black and the stars came out like 1,000 tiny lanterns strung across the sky. The air still smelled faintly of gunpowder and fear, the echo of the settlers' rifles lingering in Abigail's mind long after their dust had vanished from the horizon. She sat near the fire, knees pulled close to her chest, watching the flames flicker and die in bursts of orange light that caught in her tear-streaked face. Tarek worked a short distance away, silent as always, his hands steady as he cleaned his bow and set his arrows in order. Though his eyes kept flicking toward her every so often, not prying, just watching, making sure she was still whole. When the wind shifted, carrying the cold of the open desert into the canyon, she finally spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "They left me again," she said, not looking up. "First my husband, then the wagon train, now them." Her words tumbled out in a fragile rush, each one cracking under the weight of grief she'd been holding in since the desert swallowed her old life. I thought if I saw them again, maybe they'd take me back. Maybe I'd still belong somewhere." She let out a bitter laugh that turned into a sob. "But I don't. Not to them. Not to anyone." The tears came harder then, falling hot against her dusted cheeks, her shoulders trembling under the force of it. Tarek said nothing, but she heard him move slow, deliberate until he stood beside her. He crouched down, the firelight painting his face in bronze and shadow. She couldn't meet his gaze. "You don't understand," she murmured. "They called me tainted, like I'm already dead." Tarek's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes softened that deep, quiet empathy that didn't need words to be known. After a moment, he reached for his horse, the big chestnut that grazed nearby, and led it closer, the animal's breath misting in the cool air. He held the reins out toward her, placing them gently in her lap. "Go," he said, the single word heavy with meaning even through the barrier of language. "Home." She looked at him, startled, shaking her head. "Home?" The word scraped from her throat like a wound reopening. "I don't have one. Don't you see? They made sure of that." Her voice broke, and the reins slipped from her fingers, falling soundlessly into the sand. Tarek knelt there, still as stone, the firelight dancing in his eyes. Slowly she lifted her gaze to meet his, her breath trembling. "You're the only one who didn't leave me," she whispered. For the first time since he'd found her in the desert, his face changed a deep breath, a flicker of something unguarded crossing his features. He didn't speak at first, only watched her as if weighing the truth of her words against everything he'd seen in this hard, unforgiving land. Then, Without hesitation, he reached out and placed his hand over hers. His skin was warm, his touch firm but gentle, grounding her in the present moment like an anchor against the storm of her sorrow. He nodded once solemnly, the gesture saying more than words ever could. "You are not alone." Not anymore. The wind swept through the canyon then, stirring the ashes of the fire and sending sparks dancing into the night sky. Abigail closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the desert ease from her chest. Somewhere in the darkness, a coyote called lonely, but not lost. She squeezed Tarak's hand in return, her tears drying on her cheeks as the fire burned low between them, not as a barrier, but as the fragile, flickering heart of something new, a beginning carved out of mercy, in a place that had never known kindness. The road to the Mesa Valley wound through miles of red stone and silence, the air heavy with the scent of sage and rain-soaked earth. Abigail rode behind Tarak on his horse, her hands gripping the worn leather of the saddle, her eyes wide as the land unfolded before her, ridges carved by centuries of wind, canyons deep as sorrow, and far off in the distance, a scatter of dwellings built from clay and timber nestled in a valley where the earth seemed to bleed rust and gold. It was late afternoon when they arrived, the sun casting long shadows over the sandstone cliffs, and though the sight of other people should have brought comfort, her heart quickened with unease. The village stirred as they rode in. Children paused in their games. Women at the fires turned to stare. Men stood still with flint and bow in hand. To them, she must have looked like a ghost. Pale skin burned raw by the sun, hair tangled in yellow like dry grass, eyes too blue for this land. Tarak dismounted first, speaking softly in his language, his tone even, respectful. The villagers murmured among themselves, their glances flicking between him and her, suspicion, curiosity, fear. She wanted to shrink beneath their eyes, to disappear, but Tarak's steady presence anchored her. He spoke again, gesturing toward her, his words low and sure. She didn't understand them, but his meaning was clear. "She is under my care." The murmurs quieted, though the distrust lingered like the desert heat. An older woman stepped forward, then tall, proud, her gray hair braided and bound with leather. Her eyes were sharp but not unkind. Tarak bowed his head slightly, addressing her with respect. "Nata," he said. And though Abigail couldn't catch the words that followed, she understood from his tone that this woman was someone important, a healer, perhaps, or an elder. Nata's gaze lingered on Abigail, studying her as though she were reading a story written in scars and dust. After a long silence, she said something in Navajo that made the others murmur again, softer this time. Then she pointed to Abigail and spoke clearly, a faint smile ghosting her lips. "Ashkiazda," she said. The sound of it felt like a song. Tarak glanced at Abigail and nodded once, repeating the words. "Ashkiazda," he said again, and then, in halting English, "Woman, reborn." The meaning struck her like a breath of cool wind through heat. Reborn. It was not forgiveness, not yet, but it was something close, a name that offered her a place among them, however small. In the days that followed, she learned what it meant to earn her keep in this new world. The first mornings were hardest, waking to the rhythm of drums and voices instead of the creak of wagon wheels, to the smell of juniper smoke instead of coal, to a language that moved like river water around her ears. The villagers watched her always, their eyes wary but curious as she carried water, scrubbed hides, mended clothes. She burned her hands more than once trying to help with the cooking, earning quiet laughter from the younger women. And each night she collapsed by the fire, too exhausted to think of what she'd lost. Slowly, the stares began to soften. The children, braver than their parents, approached her first shy smiles, small hands tugging at her skirt, questions in words she couldn't yet understand. When one of them fell ill, she tended him with what little knowledge she remembered from her own mother: cool cloths, water, patience. The fever broke by dawn, and Nata found her there, still awake, whispering soft prayers to gods not her own. The old woman sat beside her and, without a word, placed a hand on her shoulder. From then on, Nata taught her the language, the customs, the meaning of silence and gratitude. Each night by the fire, Abigail repeated the strange words, her tongue stumbling at first, then steadying. And with every new word learned, the distance between her and these people grew smaller. She was no longer just the pale ghost who had come from the desert. She was Ashki Azza, the woman reborn, and for the first time since the world had broken her, she felt the faint, steady pulse of belonging. The desert had softened with the turn of the season, the hard edges of winter fading into long golden evenings where the air hung warm and sweet with the smell of sage and wild bloom. By then, the whispers in the village had quieted to murmurs of acceptance, and Abigail Ashki Azza, as they now called her, found herself walking freely through the paths between the dwellings, her hands no longer empty but always full with tasks or gifts from grateful neighbors. Yet it was the evenings she lived for most when the day's work was done. The fires burned low, and the sky began to bleed into ribbons of crimson and gold above the red cliffs. That was when Tarak would appear, quiet as always, waiting near the edge of the mesa where the wind caught his hair and the horizon stretched forever. She would join him without words, and they'd sit side by side as the sun sank into the earth. He taught her language in those moments, not just words, but meanings that ran deeper than any she'd known before. Nuchi, he'd say, gesturing to the breeze lifting her hair. Wind. She repeated it softly, her voice trembling with care. He nodded once, approving, then touched his chest lightly. Toe, he murmured. Water. He pointed toward her, his eyes steady and warm. She heart. She blinked, unsure, and then repeated. Heart. He smiled faintly, the corners of his mouth curving like sunlight breaking over stone. Each evening became another lesson, sometimes spoken, sometimes silent, but always filled with a quiet that felt sacred, as though the desert itself listened. One night, as the sky turned violet and the first stars began to shimmer, he told her the word for laughter, Ayoo. When she tried to say it, she stumbled, the sound twisting wrong on her tongue, and he chuckled low and rich, the sound rare enough to make her forget the ache that still lived somewhere deep inside her. Without thinking, she laughed too, bright and unguarded, the sound echoing off the cliffs like a song the canyon hadn't heard in years. Tarek froze for a heartbeat, then looked at her as if the world itself had shifted, his gaze soft, reverent, full of something that made her heart stumble. For the first time, Abigail didn't look away. They sat like that until the firelight faded and the stars took the sky entirely. Two lost souls who had somehow found home in each other's quiet. When dawn broke the next morning, she woke to find him gone, his bedroll neatly folded, his bow and knife missing. For a moment, panic flared, that old fear of being left, of waking to emptiness. But then she saw it, resting carefully on the blanket beside her, a bracelet of turquoise and rawhide, the stone smooth and bright, catching the first light of morning. She lifted it with trembling fingers, the weight of it small but heavy with meaning. Nata appeared not long after, her sharp eyes soft with knowing. Tarak, she said, nodding toward the bracelet, then tapped her chest. Heart. Abigail understood then not just the word, but what it meant among his people. This was no trinket, no passing gift. It was a promise, a declaration, a sign that his spirit had chosen hers. Her breath caught as she slipped it over her wrist, the cool stone pressing against her skin like a pulse. The desert wind stirred, carrying with it the scent of rain and wild sage, and she smiled faintly, whispering the word he had taught her, tasting it in the dawn. Heart. Somewhere out in the red cliffs, she knew he was watching the same sunrise, and though the distance between them was wide, it no longer felt like loneliness. It felt like belonging, painted in light and turquoise, bound by the language they had built together from silence and mercy. The morning the soldiers came, the sky was the color of steel, cold and unfeeling, the kind of gray that made even the desert feel small beneath it. Abigail was at the river with Nata, washing linen and humming one of the soft songs the old woman had taught her. When the first sound reached them, the rhythmic thunder of hooves rolling like distant thunder through the Mesa Valley. At first, she thought it might be hunters returning, but the rhythm was too sharp, too uniform, too trained. She looked up, heart stuttering. Dust was rising beyond the ridge, and beneath it glinted the unmistakable flash of metal rifles, buttons, sabers catching the light. Soldiers. Her blood turned to ice. By the time she and Nata reached the village, the riders were already descending into the valley, blue coats against red rock, the flag whipping behind them like a warning. The people scattered, pulling children into the homes carved from clay and timber, though Tarak didn't move. He stood in the center of the clearing, tall and silent, his bow laid aside, his hands empty but his gaze steady. The captain dismounted first, a hard-faced man with eyes sharp from years of giving orders no decent heart could live with. "We're here under authority of the United States Army," he barked. "We've had reports of hostiles in this valley." His eyes swept the village and stopped on her. Abigail felt the weight of his stare like a blow. "You there," he said, disbelief creeping into his voice. "By God, a white woman? Ma'am, what are you doing here?" She tried to answer, but the words tangled in her throat. "You're an American," he went on, louder now, as if her silence was an insult. "You're coming with us." The villagers murmured behind her, fear and anger rippling through them. Tarak stepped forward then, calm as the stone beneath his feet, and placed himself between her and the soldiers. The captain's expression darkened. "Step aside," he ordered. Tarak didn't move. The soldiers shifted uneasily, their rifles lowering toward him, the metallic clicks echoing through the still air. Abigail's heart pounded so loud she could hear it in her ears. "Don't," she whispered. But Tarak only glanced back at her, his eyes steady, not fearful, not reckless, just certain. The captain's voice rose again, tight with anger. "This doesn't concern you, savage. She's one of ours." That word savage struck something deep and raw in her, snapping whatever thread of fear still held her silent. She stepped forward, pushing past Tarak until she stood between him and the captain's gun. "You'll have to kill me too," she said, her voice trembling but strong enough to carry across the clearing. The captain froze, the words hanging in the air like smoke. Behind her, Tarak didn't move, but she felt his breath steady and calm, like the earth itself had drawn strength from her defiance. "Ma'am," the captain began, his tone shifting, uncertain now. "You don't understand." "I understand perfectly," she cut in, her eyes blazing. "You left me to die once." He didn't. The soldiers glanced at one another, the unease in their ranks spreading. No one wanted to be the one to pull the trigger on a woman, let alone one who looked like the ghost of every mistake they'd ever buried. The captain's jaw clenched. "You're making a mistake," he said finally, spitting the words like dust. He looked to his men, then back to her, weighing pride against conscience. For a long moment, no one breathed. Then, with a sharp motion, he lowered his rifle. "Mount up," he ordered, his voice low, strained. "We're done here." The soldiers hesitated, then obeyed, wheeling their horses around. Abigail didn't move until they were specks of dust again on the far ridge. Only then did her knees give way, the adrenaline draining from her like water through sand. Tarak caught her before she fell, his hands firm on her shoulders. She looked up at him, tears streaking the dust on her face, and saw that same calm stillness in his eyes, not pride, not triumph, but something deeper. The quiet understanding of two souls who had finally chosen the same side of the world. Behind them, the village slowly came alive again, whispers rising like wind through the juniper trees. Nata stood near the fire, watching them both with a faint smile, and murmured softly, almost to herself, "Ashki Azja, the woman reborn." The night of the ceremony rose like a dream from the ashes of fear, the air thick with the scent of burning cedar and the sound of drums that pulsed in time with Abigail's heartbeat. The mesa glowed under the moon, its cliffs painted in shades of silver and shadow, while the people gathered in a wide circle around the great fire that cracked and roared at the valley's heart. Sparks lifted into the sky like stars being born, and in their light, faces shimmered strong, weathered, and solemn. Abigail stood near Nata, her hands trembling though she tried to steady them, her heart still echoing with the memory of rifles and shouted orders from that morning. She could scarcely believe what had followed, that after the soldiers had vanished into the horizon, the tribe had not turned from her, but drawn her close. The elder, a man with hair white as snow and eyes deep as canyon stone, had watched her for a long while in silence before speaking words she could barely understand, his voice carrying through the evening like the slow roll of thunder. Tarak had translated only one sentence for her, touching his hand to his heart. "The spirits have seen your courage. You belong." Now, as the drums deepened, he stepped forward into the firelight, his shadow tall against the red earth. The crowd parted for him, and Abigail felt her breath catch when his gaze met hers steady, unwavering. The same look that had faced down soldiers and storms alike. Nata touched her arm gently, nodding for her to step forward. The people murmured as she did, their voices low and reverent, not as strangers looking upon an outsider, but as witnesses to a joining that was both rare and sacred. The elder spoke again, his words rolling over the crowd like wind across the dunes. And though Abigail couldn't follow their meaning, she felt them in her bones, a language older than any she'd ever known, one that spoke not to the mind but to the spirit. When he finished, Tarak extended his hand. She took it, her fingers fitting against his calloused palm, the contact steadying her even as her heart pounded with something fierce and new. He reached to the small pouch at his side, untying it carefully. Inside lay a necklace, a simple band of woven sinew threaded with small beads of silver and bone, smooth from years of wear. He lifted it slowly, reverently, holding it up to the firelight so that the flames danced across its surface. "This," he said softly in English, his accent shaping each word like stone under water, "is my spirit." Then, with quiet care, he placed it around her neck. The cool weight of it settled against her skin, and she felt a rush of warmth spread through her, not from the fire, but from something deeper, something that anchored her to the earth beneath her feet. The elder raised his hands and spoke again, and this time Tarek's voice joined his, low and steady. When they fell silent, Nata stepped forward, sprinkling a handful of sand into the flames, where it hissed and flared bright blue. "Fire for life," the old woman said, smiling faintly at Abigail. Then she reached down, scooping a bit of sand from the ground and pressing it into Abigail's palm. "Sand for earth." Together, they bind what cannot be broken. The people murmured approval, the circle tightening, voices rising in song, a chant of renewal, of unity, of love born from the harsh mercy of the desert. Tarek turned to her then, his fingers brushing the turquoise bracelet still on her wrist, the one he had given her weeks before. "Ashkiazda," he said softly, the name they had given her. No more alone. The world seemed to fall away around them, the drums, the fire, even the starlit cliffs, until there was only the space between their joined hands, warm and steady. Abigail felt her eyes sting, but she didn't look away. For the first time since her husband's death, since the desert had swallowed her past and left her empty, she no longer felt like a ghost clinging to what was lost. She was not a survivor of the plains or a forgotten settler's wife. She was his equal, bound not by law or nation, but by the wild, enduring rhythm of the desert that had remade them both. As the tribe's song swelled and the fire roared higher, she leaned into him, and together they stood beneath the endless sky, husband and wife joined by will, by courage, and by the unforgiving beauty of the land that had refused to let either of them die. The years rolled over the desert like the wind that shaped its dunes, steady, quiet, relentless, and with them came a peace Abigail had never believed she'd find again. The Mesa Valley changed with the seasons, and so did she. In spring, wildflowers painted the red earth with streaks of gold and violet, and the air hummed with the scent of rain on stone. In summer, the sun burned high and hard, but under the cool shade of the cliffs, life thrived. She learned to weave with the women, to grind maize with rhythm and patience, to read the whisper of the wind for storms and the cry of birds for change. Her tongue, once clumsy with the Navajo words, grew fluid, soft. Her voice carried through the village with laughter instead of sorrow. Tarak built their home near the spring where he had first found her, the place where his shadow had fallen over her dying body and turned it toward life again. It wasn't much, just walls of clay and timber and a roof of woven brush, but it was theirs, and every stone laid by his hand felt like a vow. When the sun dipped low each evening, she would sit beside him and hum the old songs Nata had taught her, their melody winding through the air like smoke, and Tarak would carve bone or polish turquoise, his hands never idle. They spoke both their languages now, one folding into the other until even silence became a kind of speech between them. In time, the people no longer called her Ashki Azza, the woman reborn. She was simply Abigail, or sometimes Mother of Rivers, for the way she tended to every life that crossed her path. When Nata grew too old to walk, Abigail cared for her, whispering prayers in both tongues at her bedside until the old woman passed into the next world smiling. On the day Tarek buried her, the wind carried the scent of cedar, and Abigail felt that the land itself was mourning gently, but not with despair. And then, one summer evening, as a storm gathered in the distance and thunder rolled across the mesa, Abigail felt the first pangs of new life stirring inside her. The birth was hard, the kind that blurs the line between strength and surrender, but when it was done, Tarek placed their son in her arms, his tiny body wrapped in a blanket woven by the village women, his skin kissed by two worlds, his dark eyes blinking against the firelight. "He needs a name," Tarek said softly, brushing a lock of hair from her damp forehead. She looked down at the child, her heart swelling with something too vast to contain. "Matthew," she whispered, first the name of her father and of the life she'd left behind, a name of the language she once thought had no place here. Tarek tilted his head, the word foreign but not unwelcome. Then she added, "Tarek Reed." She smiled through tears, her fingers tracing the baby's cheek. "Both worlds," she murmured. "The one that betrayed me, and the one that saved me." Tarek understood without needing more words. He leaned forward, pressing his forehead to hers, the same way he had done the night of their joining. Outside, rain began to fall, gentle, cleansing, rare, and the earth drank it greedily. In the years that followed, the child grew like the desert flowers that found their way through rock and heat. He spoke both tongues before he could walk, ran barefoot through the canyons, laughed with the village children, and listened wide-eyed to the stories his parents told by the fire. Sometimes Abigail would watch him and think how strange and miraculous it was that her life, the one the desert should have swallowed, had instead rooted here, blooming where nothing was meant to grow. And when the sun sank low and the land turned to gold, she would hold her son close, feel Tarek's arm around her shoulders, and know that she had finally become what the elder had once called her, not lost, not reborn, but home. Years slipped away like wind through canyon stone, carving their stories into the land until even the earth seemed to remember them. The Mesa Valley grew quieter as time moved on, fewer riders, fewer wagons, fewer signs of the restless world beyond. But for those who still dared the desert, chasing dreams or running from ghosts, there was a legend whispered around campfires from Santa Fe to the Colorado plains. They spoke of a place where the red cliffs met a spring clear enough to see the sky reflected in it, and of a woman who lived there, fair-skinned, hair streaked with silver, eyes pale as morning light. Some said she was a ghost, others an angel, but all agreed on her kindness. When travelers stumbled from the dunes, sunburned and half-dead with thirst, they'd find her waiting a jug of water in her hands, a quiet strength in her stance. She spoke with a voice shaped by both the wind of the desert and the lilt of distant towns, her English softened by the rhythm of Navajo, her Navajo brightened by the warmth of another life. Her name, they said, was Abigail Reed once, though most only knew her by the name the tribes had given her, Ashki Azza, the woman reborn. At her side was a man whose presence was as still and solid as the mountains, Tarek, the Navajo who'd defied soldiers and storms alike for love. His hair had turned to shadowed gray, his eyes calm and knowing. Together they tended their spring like guardians of an old promise, offering water, shelter, and a story to those who came seeking either mercy or direction. Children of the valley grew up hearing her tale, learning the words she'd woven from two worlds, words of forgiveness, courage, and the strange alchemy of survival that turns pain into grace. When they asked her why she stayed, she would smile, her gaze drifting to the horizon where the land burned gold at dusk, and say, "Because the desert gave me back what the world took away." No one ever left her camp without something, a full canteen, a healed wound, or a piece of wisdom wrapped in gentleness. And when the wind carried her laughter across the canyons at twilight, it sounded like the echo of rain after drought, fleeting, precious, impossible to forget. Some said her son, Matthew Tarek Reed, grew to lead both the people of the valley and those who settled nearby, bridging a world that once divided itself in blood. Others swore they saw him years later riding east, a turquoise bracelet on his wrist, telling the story of how his mother had once defied the sun itself and lived. When the spring dried for a season and no one saw the couple again, riders searched the cliffs and found only their home still neat, still standing, with 2 cups beside the hearth and a small turquoise necklace hanging by the door. The wind there never stopped, whispering through the stone like an old song. Even now, the oldest herders who pass that way at dusk sometimes claim they see two figures near the firelight, a man and a woman, sitting side by side beneath the same wide sky, watching over the endless red sands. And when strangers ask who they were, the herders always answer the same. The desert took her once. Love brought her back. That's the desert widow, and the man who taught her the desert's heart still beats for those who listen.